Today's Dirt Path devotional comes from 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8. And it says, Saul waited 7 days just as Samuel had told him to. But Saul didn't come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So in chapter 13, and really this section of 1 Samuel, God's people, the Israelites, are preparing to go into battle to face the Philistines. And Saul, as king, that's what he's preparing to lead them to do. That's his role as the king over God's people, right? He's to govern them. He's to lead them, and he's also to serve and protect them, and so that's kind of coming under that domain of his powers. But this kind of marks the beginning of Saul, the beginning of the end of Saul's reign as king, and we begin to see his favor with God kind of drift. And it really begins right here in this moment, because what Saul's going to do is step out of his lane. You see, that's his job as king, is to govern, serve, and protect the people. And Samuel is the prophet of God, though. He is God's messenger. He is the one that's supposed to offer up the sacrifices and point the folks. Not that Saul can't do that. Saul's supposed to point people to God too, but he's supposed to do it from within his role. And in verse 8, and kind of the verses surrounding it, Saul is waiting for Samuel to show up on the eve of battle, to make sacrifices to God, to call upon the name of the Lord, so that way the people can be united under the banner of God as they head into battle. So you can imagine, as Samuel isn't there after 7 days, Saul's been waiting, and Samuel just hasn't showed up. And to make matters worse, the people begin to get restless, and that causes Saul to panic. And so in his panic, he steps out of his lane, and he's the one that's going to end up offering the sacrifices, doing something that Samuel was supposed to do, not him. And God's going to get upset with Saul for this, and Samuel's going to let him know that. It's really easy to read this passage for you and I and be critical of Saul in this moment as to how he can do that. But we do the same thing. How many times do we know what the right thing to do in our heart is? We've prayed about it, and God's seemed to point us in a direction, but then we seek advice, and sometimes we get advice from people that we love and trust and who's given us good advice in the past. And because their advice is different, what they're pointing to is different, we panic. And we leave what we know God's telling us to do. We're no different than Saul in that moment. So right now, maybe you're wrestling with a decision. Maybe you're wrestling with something that you know God has told you to do, but maybe you've gotten advice elsewhere. Trust God. Trust what He's telling you. Be confident in it. Maybe you've already made that misstep. Don't be like Saul. Don't allow this to drive you further from God. In this moment, recognize that you were disobedient and go back to Him.